promise, 2 minutes. Hello and welcome back to this I-24 News Evening Edition. I'm Lucy Arish, and this is the Daily Debate. Humanitarian aid and volunteer organizations put their lives on the line on a daily basis by trying to bring comfort to civilians in times of war and suffering. Tonight, we take an inside look at what aid workers in troubled zone face on a daily basis. Joining me tonight are two very special guests, the Drori-Avraham spokesperson for Amnesty International. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. And Ran Cohen, the Executive Director of Physicians for Human Rights.
Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you very much. Both of you come from two different organizations, but before we started, I would like to understand a little bit, and for me and for our viewers, about your organization. Adi, please.
So Amnesty is not a humanitarian organization, which is, I think, is mainly the focus here. We're a human rights organization. So what we do mainly is the kind of research into the human rights violations that take place in times of conflict or in times of peace as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Physicians for Human Rights Israel, it's important to say, we are just located here in Jaffa, and we're working to protect the right to health of all people who live in Israel or under Israeli control. Therefore, we work in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in order to provide health services from one hand, from the other hand, advocate for the right to health of Palestinians and for Israeli responsibility for the situation of Palestinian citizens. And we work as well on other issues like the right to health of refugees and asylum seekers in Israel, migrant workers, prisoners and detainees, and so on. We operate two clinics, a mobile clinic with volunteer physicians that go on a weekly basis to the West Bank, yes, and to the Gaza Strip when we are permitted to. And we operate an open clinic that provides services for
You are permitted to get into Gaza, which is interesting because Israeli journalists cannot get into Gaza.
Yes, it took us time to get there, but since Israel do allow some kind of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian organizations, though we are a human rights organization, we do have volunteer physicians that are allowed to enter Gaza. It's important to say that they don't allow our Jewish physicians to enter Gaza, only Palestinians.
Only the Arab and Palestinians. Yes. So what is the importance of an organization like Amnesty, and what are the dangers that a person who works there faces on a wartime or war zone?
So I think Amnesty researchers around the world face several issues. Researchers, some countries they're not even allowed access to. Other countries, we have researchers that are being followed, harassed, intimidated. And I think the reason why we insist on going into conflict areas is because our job is to determine what kind of human rights violations happen and ensure that we can determine who is responsible for these human rights violations. One of the issues that Amnesty researchers look at in times of war is exactly the kind of the problem we see in Syria now, which is attacks on humanitarian aid workers. And what we expect from governments is to guarantee unfettered access to humanitarian aid to all civilians and to protect humanitarian aid agencies while they provide their services.
So in a case like what we heard of in the headlines for the last few days about aid workers from the Red Cross being abducted in Syria, what do you think how are you dealing with a case like that?
Well, first of all, Syria is extremely tricky right now for everyone. I think it's fair to say Amnesty has said that before and others have said that before. It's probably the most dangerous place right now for journalists and for humanitarian aid workers. And it's especially worrying considering we know that the UN predicted that by the end of the year, 10 million people in Syria will need humanitarian aid. In terms of what can be done about it, I think the main point, the main thing is to find the political will within the international community to address the problem, because it is a growing trend. Syria is is the gravest kind of manifestation of the situation right now. But we know that, for example, in Somalia, humanitarian aid workers are being targeted and killed. We know that in Sudan it happens a lot. We know that humanitarian aid workers are also being used as pawns a lot of times in political, kind of international political games. So, for example, when Omar al-Bashir was, when the International Criminal Court wanted to arrest Omar al-Bashir, humanitarian aid workers were expelled from the country. That was at a time when 1 million people were in dire need of food aid. In terms of what can be done, I think the main thing is political will from the international community, and I think that the same way that the international community kind of galvanized together to address the issue of chemical weapons in Syria, we need the same kind of political will to ensure that humanitarian aid workers and journalists are protected in Syria and other areas of conflict.
We just heard what Adi had to say, and politics is a very big thing here in the Middle East, especially between the Palestinians and the Israelis. How do you see it in your organization? How do you see that politics get into your work?
Well, first of all, I agree with Adi when she says that there's a need for a political will. I think that we must admit that there's no humanitarian solution for a humanitarian crisis. It will be even a lie to think that we can solve these issues by providing humanitarian care. The solution is, first of all, political, and humanitarian aid is there to help people survive until a political solution will bring an end to this conflict. A human rights work is, in many different aspects, a political work, because you don't just provide care, but you're trying to change reality and change policies, and changing policies is a political work. You work, in the case of Israel, you work in the government, or you work in the Knesset, and you do media work, and you write reports, and you collect evidence, and so on, and you're not doing it just to show how good you are, but you're doing it to change a reality.
By touching the person and the people, you're actually maybe changing a way of thinking.
Yes, you're changing it.
Because for some people in the West Bank, this encounter with Jewish physicians is the first time for them where they're seeing Jewish who are not soldiers.
This is true, and this is in many cases also the first time for physicians, Israeli physicians, to arrive to the West Bank and to meet Palestinians, because Israelis don't do it on a daily basis. They usually don't cross the green line to go and visit Palestinian villages. So it works for the best for the two sides, and indeed it makes a change in people's lives and people's way of looking at reality and seeing the other side and so on. But this is a very specific level. On a higher level, and as an organization that wants to make a bigger change, politics is unavoidable. This is something that you cannot escape from. And in a way, I think a human rights organization that will say, I'm not political, is not a human rights organization, because the human rights work is to change policies. And when it comes to issues like Syria and so on, of course, thinking that the Syrian government will respect the life or the neutrality of aid workers is a bit absurd, because we see what happens there in the last 2.5 years.
They don't respect their own lives.
So maybe the solution here, or what the international community needs to do, is take a step forward in thinking how we can protect not only health workers and not only journalists, but NGO workers in general, or aid workers in general. Think of and agree on the terms, and maybe add something to a specific convention or something like that the states can agree upon. And even if it's not respected, like in many cases, there are still the basis that we can later legally challenge it.
So you're saying that it's not respected in many cases. How frustrated it is to work in an organization that your only purpose is to help and to bring aid to people, and you're not respected, and you're not being cherished or you're not being appreciated for your work?
I think the main issue is not, I think as Ran says, the NGOs are important because they provide a service that is needed. I think the real issue and the real thing we need to think about when humanitarian aid workers are being attacked, the people who are supposed to get that aid, whether it's the food or the water or the medical care, they're the actual victims. Of course, no one wants, every aid worker should be able to go home, should be able to travel freely, should be safe while they're doing their work. But the effects of not protecting human rights organizations and humanitarian aid organizations, the effects of that are really could be disastrous for local communities, for displaced people, for refugees, for people who are caught up in really, really serious situation of human rights violations. And I think that's where the concern should be, because when an agency feels it's under attack or it cannot protect its workers, it'll either limit its operations or sometimes even leave the country, and the people who are left behind are the people who suffer. And I think it's really important, as Ran says, to keep this kind of conversation really broad. So it's not just no, I'm not saying just, but humanitarian workers. It's also the journalists. It's also the local human rights defenders who are on the ground. All kinds of civilians who are kind of party to a conflict should be protected. But by the international community, that should be the kind of main priority when it comes to conflict.
So I'm hearing a lot of frustration about international community, about politicians, and I think one of the most common things that I hear when people are talking about physicians for human rights is that a group of lefties, that they are not, that they don't love Israel, they're against Israel, they're going and helping the enemy. And isn't it frustrating to hear that when everything that you're doing is helping human beings to get help?
Of course it is. Of course it's frustrating. Of course it's making it much harder than it is anyway. But this is the work, and the work is not just to help people. The work is also explaining to Israelis why it's important and why we do it, and why it is not because we are anti-Israel or we hate Israel, but sometimes on vice versa, because we care about this place, because we care about Israel, because we care about Palestine, because we care about the future and our children, we do it. We are not running a sprint. This is not 100 meters. It's a marathon.
You know, I was in one of your trips to, in one of your groups that went with the physicians to one of the villages in the West Bank, and it was very frustrating to get back from there. And especially my frustration was about the Palestinian leadership, because one woman there was a very old lady who said, the Jewish are doing something that the Arabs are not doing for us. And there's a lot of frustration about, you cannot believe that in a 30 minutes drive from Tel Aviv, you get to a place that maybe it's like a third world place, that you cannot believe that it's actually happening and things are actually like that there. So do you hear this type of criticism against the Palestinian leadership for not doing anything for their own people? Because they are getting aid. Yes,
of course we hear criticism also against the Palestinian leadership, not caring enough, not doing enough. It's partly right. I mean, the Palestinian leadership is not doing it always right, and they have lots of problems. In many cases, also corruption, or there are questions that should be asked, to where do the money go, or what are the priorities, and so on. But at least from our point of view in Physicians for Human Rights, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are still under Israeli control and are under Israeli occupation in many aspects of life, and therefore
I feel like you have a responsibility.
it's not we have responsibility, of course, but the government of Israel and the citizens of Israel has responsibility.
I have, unfortunately, I have no time. I told you that 16 minutes passed very quick. We're going out for a small break, 10 minutes break, update from our news desk, and then we're back to the I-24 News. One-on-one. 10 million.